Guys, welcome to another week of CT12. And this is a kind of a transition week in terms of Colossians 3. If you can remember the flow of this chapter, it begins with union with Christ. It moves to killing sin, moves on to a description of character and of Christian community. And what's wonderful about this last section is that it begins to identify some of the roles that we have and some of the roles that we have as Christian men. And the first of these roles is that role of husband. And it's really important. This is something that we need to think about, that we need to talk about as groups of men, even if you're not married. If you're not married yet, or maybe you're an older man and you've never been married. Nonetheless, there's something about this role that reveals what it means as a man to take responsibility and to honor the Lord in a sense of humility in taking on that responsibility that he's given us as men. And so this is a fruitful topic for every guy to discuss, whether he's married or he's single. Now, with these verses regarding marriage, there's a couple things I want to say. First, there's a word that Paul uses, and it's a really, really bad word. It's an obscene word in modern society. This is the kind of word that if you were to say this word in public, you're going to face possibly ridicule, but more than likely some severe criticism. It's the thing that you feel ashamed that you just don't say in public. And what is this word that is so terrible? It's the word submit. Paul says for wives to submit to their husbands as is fitting in the Lord. Now, we've got to think about this word, and we've got to recover this word, because ultimately we don't want to be ashamed of this word. And I'll give you one reason, and this is going to help you realize why we shouldn't be embarrassed about this word. And that reason is because the whole of the life of the Lord Jesus is an act of submission. We've got to recognize this, that the whole of Jesus' life was an act of coming underneath the mission of the Father. And so, if it's true that Jesus willingly submitted throughout the whole of his life to the Father and did so joyfully, there's nothing shameful about Jesus' life. There's nothing degrading about the kind of lifestyle that he lived. And so if he was willing and if he rejoiced in exemplifying this virtue, well, we can't be ashamed of it as believers. And so let me just encourage you, go to Philippians 2, look at the life of Jesus, and think about the way in which that act of submission, which is not just something that wives are called to. Look at the parallel passage in Ephesians. You'll see that we're all as Christians called to submit to one another. That submission is something that, Christians, we glory in. We glory in coming underneath one another, loving and serving each other. Now, the other thing I want to say is regarding that role of a husband. And sometimes in Christian circles, men like to fixate on authority. And there is something in terms of being a husband, that there is a kind of authority, there's a kind of headship that we're called to. But what I want you to primarily think about is the way in which, as a husband, you are responsible before God. The problem with thinking about authority is it can easily become a kind of pedestal that we stand on and look down from on other people. There's a real danger that can feed our egos. Whereas if we come at it from the angle of responsibility, there's not really any pride that we're going to feed. And so what we've got to recognize is that as men, God holds us responsible for our marriages and for our families. And that's why it's really important that as you meet with your band of brothers, that you're talking about the big subjects. Subjects like, how is your relationship with your wife? What's the state of your marriage right now? And what I want you to see is that what God is going to hold us responsible for is if we're loving our wives well. That's what Paul says, love your wives. And so guys, don't think of your wife as being there to serve you. That's not the model of leadership that Christ has given us. He laid down his life for us. And so what we need to do and we need to grow in together is we need to replicate that love. And we need to lay down our lives. We need to love our wives. As Paul says, don't be harsh with them. We want all of those virtues that we've been thinking about from Colossians 3, the kindness, the humility, the patience. We want these things to overflow out of our hearts. And if our wives are blessed with that kind of character, then we're going to see them come to spiritual life. And it's going to make a huge difference in our marriage and in our families. And so guys, spend some time this week reflecting, thinking about what it means to be a Christian man, but in that context of being a Christian husband and serving the Lord in that vocation.